Welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. Be talking about the trait approach to understanding personality. Start off with some of the basic assumptions of the approach. Well, the first thing would be to define what they mean by trait. A trait is simply a dimensional characteristic of an individual's personality. Okay, so for now let's focus on one part of it. It's a characteristic. So what's a characteristic? Well, characteristic is something that's a distinguishing quality. So something about an individual that might be different in him or her than someone else. Not a physical characteristic, but a psychological characteristic, right? A personality characteristic. So something about the way the person acts, thinks, and feels that might be different than somebody else. So probably pretty much anything you can think of as a descriptive feature of another person. Talk about what's somebody like, other than describing their physical features. What are they like? Anything you come up with could probably be considered a personality trait. Let's try to think of some. Shyness. Someone's shy. They're inquisitive, bold, nettlesome, flamboyant, charming. You could go on and on. And some researchers have actually gone through and used kind of a lexical approach to look at all the words that are used in the English language and in other languages to describe a person. And there are a lot of ways to describe people, more than maybe you would think at first. That's what traits are. And one thing about the trait approach is it's a departure from thinking about individuals as falling into one of a set of categories. So we talk about somebody having the trait of shyness. We don't talk about somebody being the shy type. It's not you're shy or you're not shy. It's not a yes/no categorical thing. Nonetheless, you'll notice even the author of this chapter falls back into the language of typology many times, using words like categorize and talking about which group a person falls in, because that's the nature of the way our minds work. It's easier to understand things by categorizing them. So we talk about people being high or low in a trait. So you're either high or you're low. We don't talk about anywhere in the middle. But really, from a theoretical standpoint of the trait approach, it's not about high versus low. It's about being somewhere on this continuum. So, not categories, but dimensions. So traits are dimensional in nature. So for any trait you can think of, you can not only be high or low, but you can be anywhere in between. And there are an infinite number of values on a continuum. From the very highest to the very lowest, there's an infinite number of values in between. The thinking is that people occur at all different levels on the continuum. But if we measured a large enough group of individuals, if we got everybody in the population, and we measured them on any given trait, that we would probably find a normal distribution. So traits are normally distributed. And what that means is you get this kind of normal curve, the classic bell curve, right, where for a measure of friendliness, there'll be a small number of people that are super, super, super friendly, at the very kind of high end of friendliness. Ooh, that's too friendly. And then a very small number of people who are way unfriendly. Just stab you if they see you. But then most people are somewhere in the middle. Most people aggregate around some average amount of friendliness. You might be slightly higher than average, slightly lower than average. Most people are within one standard deviation of average, of the typical, of the middle school. And the assumption is that's true of most traits, that most traits are normally distributed in a population. Another assumption is that traits are stable over time. So if you're high in extroversion today, then you'll probably be high in extroversion 10 years from now. And there's a recognition, if we measure, one instance now of you being extroverted, how extroverted are you? We observe you in one situation, and then we observe you in one situation 10 years from now. We may not see the same level of extroversion. From a trait approach, that's true, but if we took 20 separate measurements, we looked at you 20 different times and maybe 20 different situations and measured your extroversion in each of those situations today and got some average, and then the same thing 10 years from now, we've measured you 20 different times, maybe 20 different situations, and got some average, those two averages for you as an individual will be quite similar. So from that standpoint, personality on average traits are thought to be stable. And it's not that personality doesn't change at all, because it does continue to change, and there's debate about when change starts to slow down. But there is general agreement that as you move into adulthood, possibly in your 30s, possibly in your 40s, change in personality begins to slow, and you begin to kind of become more of who you are, and there's less variability in your behavior. But personality does change, but when it does, it's usually subtle and slow. Also, over several years, you may become slightly different. So it's stable over time, and also let's assume that traits are stable across situations. So if you're greedy when it comes to sharing your marshmallows with your cousins, you probably also won't drop your spare change in the Salvation Army bucket outside the mall. So if you're high or low on a trait in one situation, you'll also be high or low on that same trait in other situations where that trait could be expressed. Okay. Now, this trait approach is a little bit different from the other theories we talked about, the Freudian and neo-Freudian theories, and even other theories we talked about after it. And one of the key differences is it's not really focused on predicting individual behavior. It's not about trying to figure out what is this person going to do, at least from the theoretical point of view. As we'll talk about application later, it is used to make predictions about individual behavior, but these are based on normative comparisons. So for trait theory, the focus is on identifying relationships between trait levels in a group to some other variable or variables. Now, when you gather enough data about people that are high, low, and in between on some trait, and how scores on that trait relate to some other variable, once you have enough data about that, then you can make predictions based on some individuals. So if you find a clear relationship between level of conscientiousness and how hard somebody's going to work at their job, if you find a significant positive correlation, then you can measure one individual's conscientiousness and make a prediction about how hard they're going to work at their job. And there's an understanding when we look at correlations that the prediction won't be perfect, but it's better than basing your judgment on tarot cards or some other random method. So again, not directly focused on predicting individual behavior, but in the application, it is used to predict individual behavior based on what we know about groups. Another difference is there's not really a unified view on personality development. There's not really trait theorists out there, modern ones, that talk about how you come to be high or low on traits. And trait theorists and researchers do look at the questions of why some individuals are higher or lower on some traits, but usually they'll pick some trait, like, okay, well, in terms of self-efficacy, why are some people higher or lower on self-efficacy? But then that'll be a separate question from why are some people higher or lower on openness to experience. And there isn't a consistent theory that says, okay, well, being high on any given trait will be because of this, or being low because of this. It's because of parental experiences, or it's because of early childhood stuff. There's no theory in the trait approach about why you get to be the way you are. So in terms of predicting for any given theory why you might be higher or lower, usually they borrow from other theories to guide their predictions of why people might be higher or lower on a continuum. Similarly, there's not a unified view on why some people might experience increases or decreases in a trait. Because again, there's research on, okay, well, why do people experience increases or decreases on self-efficacy? But the theory about why that happens and the understanding of what happens might be different than the understanding of why people might change the where they stand on a measure of neuroticism, of kind of experiencing negative affect. This might be two very distinct understandings of why people change. So there's not one understanding of, okay, well, why do you change on traits in general. Okay. So it's a little bit different than other approaches. And to understand where it is now, we have to kind of look at the development of the approach, the trait approach, or the trait theories. If you think about it, there's not only one single trait theory. One of the earliest figures, obviously, is Gordon Allport, who talked about this kind of hierarchy of traits: cardinal, central, and secondary traits. And Allport believed that not all traits were equally important or prominent in each individual. So some traits for an individual are fairly peripheral. So they might be typical of the person's behavior much of the time, but not all of the time. So in these, for these secondary traits, situation might trump personality. It might be more important determinant of behavior. So it might be that you like to be on time, but it's really not really important for you. So if you got other things to do, you don't mind being late. But if there's really nothing else competing for your interests, you'd prefer to be on time. That'd be a secondary trait for you. And it's really kind of idiographic approach where it's about the individual. And there's not the idea that, okay, well, here are these traits, and all these traits are secondary traits for everybody. It's very individualized. For you, these are secondary traits. And then for you, there might be some central traits. And these are traits that are characteristics that are more important to your self-concept and who you are, and are more typical of your behavior and seem to guide or influence your behavior more so and more consistently than those secondary traits. And then kind of the top of the hierarchy are these cardinal traits, which Allport said that are rarely found. Most individuals don't have a cardinal trait. A cardinal trait is whenever there's one trait that stands out and really defines you as a person beyond all others. Allport said something most people are defined or can be characterized by a combination of a few traits. But some people, one trait seems to dominate their personality and really drive their behaviors. Everybody knows the Old Testament story of Job, the patience of Job. If you were to describe Job, you're like, well, he was a hard-working guy. No, he was patient. That's what describes him. Think about Gandhi, his passive resistance. Gandhi probably was a more complex person, maybe, but our understanding of him is via this one kind of cardinal trait. And one other interesting thing about Allport is that in many ways, his work on trait theories reflected a rejection of those psychodynamic theories. And he was kind of interested in not so much what unconsciously motivates you, but what is it about you in the here and now that we can identify that can explain your behavior, that you can even be conscious of, that you're if we ask you some questions, you can reflect on it and realize, yeah, I'm outgoing, or no, I'm really shy, or you can have an awareness of what determines your behavior, and that makes it much easier to study, obviously. And then at the same time as Allport was working, Henry Murray, doing his work on trait theory and thinking of it slightly differently. For Murray, thinking about traits in terms of needs, right? That traits are conceptualized in terms of the strength of personal needs. For example, the need for power or the need for affiliation. So the need for power would be a trait, and you either have a strong need for power, you're kind of high in that trait, or a low need for power. But at the same time, he also recognized that behavior was influenced by situational demands, which he termed presses. And if you're low in a need for something and the press is high, then the situation will determine your behavior. If you're high in the need for something and the press is low, then your personality, your need, will determine your behavior. And Murray, in contrast to Allport, didn't really reject psychodynamic theories. In fact, he was greatly influenced by Jung, and part of the reason he had this kind of changing career path was because of reading the works of Jung, and eventually having a meeting with him. And so you can see that in his writing when you read about how he talks about the unconscious, and you can also see the influence of Freud here. I think, if you think about libido and thanatos, and then compare that to, some of the needs he talks about in terms of need for affiliation, need for sex, need for power, need for aggression. It sounds similar to some degree to kind of a drive model, but the difference being, for Freud, we all have this drive, and for Murray, talking about you'll vary. There would be individual differences in how strong these drives, these needs are in any given individual, and also many more needs or drives than the two that Freud proposed. So Allport and Murray were kind of the forerunners of trait theories, and came up with their ideas of what, for Murray, they kind of identified these needs are the ones that are important. For Allport, it was very individualized. Well, for this individual, these are the traits, and for this individual, these are the traits. And then there's a big shift after these guys that comes with the discovery of a method called factor analysis. This is really a major shift in how traits were studied and conceptualized. Rather than using, personal observations and theory to determine, what traits you're going to write about and study, the development of factor analysis, this data analytic technique, allowed for using statistics to reveal patterns of relationships among data to identify traits. So factor analysis, basically, very simplified explanation would be, if you ask people a bunch of questions, some of those questions might be correlated with each other. People might answer them in similar ways. And so the questions that are correlated with each other, that bunch together, might reflect something in common. So all those people that answered all four of these questions, if they answered one question high, they answered the other three high as well. If they answered one low, they answered the other three low as well. So they answered them in a similar way. So they seem to have something in common, and that something, theoretically, is a latent variable, something that you're not asking them directly, but that's being reflected by the answers to these questions. So when it happens, they form a factor. They all load on a particular factor, on the same factor. And you can identify, okay, how many factors are there? If out of all these questions I ask 100 questions, are there 100 different factors? Do people answer all these questions differently? Or do they answer them all the same? Or maybe there's 2 factors, maybe there's 10. Factor analysis as a statistical technique will generate a certain number of factors. And basically, it's a way of simplifying all the data. So you just ask all these questions and see what kind of factors emerge. And Cattell was the first to apply factor analysis to personality theory, which he learned about it study with Spearman, looking at actually intelligence, but then took the approach developed by Spearman to study intelligence and applied it to personality, and came up with 16 factors. So he said, okay, out of all these different descriptions of personality, all these, ask people about this trait, this trait, this trait, they can all be boiled down to 16 different traits, 16 factors. So you can be high or low on these 16 different things, and the pattern of highs and lows in these things are a good description of personality. And then while Cattell came up with his 16 factors, Hans Eysenck then followed up and used factor analysis as well. He said, actually I found that 3 factors explain the data pretty dang well as well. They explain differences among individuals better than a 16-factor solution. And then along comes Goldberg, as well as others, most notably Costa and McCrea, that said, no, 5 factors seem to work the best. And as we'll see, talk about in just a minute, the 5-factor model has dominated personality research in the past several years. It seems to have the most support. But why is it these researchers come up with different numbers? Well, factor analysis is supposed to be atheoretical, right? And that's kind of one of the big things about the shift to using factor analysis from the Allport and the Murrays was, okay, now instead of theory determining what traits to use, the data will determine what traits will emerge, and we're not going to specify how many traits there are. We'll just see what happens, where the numbers fall. But it's not entirely a theoretical approach. What factors you get depends in part on what data you put in, i.e., on what questions you ask and how you ask those questions. So that's one of the reasons that different researchers will get different factors. And another is there are different types of factor analysis. You're talking about doing what type of rotation, orthogonal rotation or an oblique rotation. We won't get into kind of the complexities of this analysis, but it's not just one method. There are variations to the method, and depending on what variation you use, that can also influence the number of factors generated. Nonetheless, by and large, a 5-factor solution seems to be dominating research right now. It's got a good bit of support. And there's still some debate, as we'll see in a minute, about, well, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 7, somewhere around 5. And 5 has the most support. And people argue about what to call the 5 factors, but the most commonly agreed upon names we'll talk about, and they make up the acronym OCEAN, which makes it easy to remember. The first one is called being openness. This is about openness to experience, so you can be high or low on this trait. People who are high on openness to experience like to try new things. They're imaginative, they're curious. People who are lower are more conservative, more dogmatic, more traditional. Conscientiousness. People who are high in conscientiousness have lots of self-control and discipline, very organized. Low in conscientiousness would be your messier people, but also maybe, depending on how you look at it, your easygoing people. Oh, I don't really care what happens. It'll get taken care of eventually. To kind of compare this to a Freudian concept, anal retentive versus anal explosive. High conscientiousness would be anal retentive. Low conscientiousness would be anal explosive. Extroversion, most people are familiar with extroversion and introversion. So kind of outgoing versus reserve, but also extroversion also associated with kind of assertiveness and kind of high energy, and introversion is sometimes associated with an independence, so not wanting to follow the crowd. Agreeableness, high levels being related to being very trusting and sympathetic, with low levels being related to very kind of skeptical, competitive, maybe even aggressive. Neuroticism, this has to do with emotional stability and the experience of negative emotions. So high neuroticism, characterized by negative affect, so anxiety, depression, anger, worry, and having a lot of changes in emotion, versus low neuroticism, fairly stable, calm, and characterized more by positive emotions, or at least the absence of negative emotions. So those are the big 5, and with the exception of neuroticism, there's not a clear, it's good to be high or low in this. There are advantages to being toward one end of the scale either way. For openness to experience, kind of the curiosity associated with high levels of openness to experience are often associated with artistic endeavors, but at the same time, people who are maybe too high on openness to experience are always trying new things and don't follow through with other things, and maybe will try things that shouldn't be tried. Experimenting with certain drugs might be associated with high levels of openness to experiences. Conscientiousness obviously seems like a pretty good thing, to be conscientious, to be punctual and organized and all those things. But again, at too high of levels, you begin to get kind of an OCPD, compulsive personality disorder type thing, overly perfectionistic and rigid, possibly. And obviously, on the other end, being too low in conscientiousness, you'll be this messy slob who's always late. Extroversion, again, usually in Western society, extroversion is usually valued over introversion in terms of being kind of outgoing and social. There's also something to be said, an argument can be made for the strengths of introversion and people that are comfortable being by themselves and don't feel a need to be around others. And agreeableness generally seems like, oh, well, it would be good to be agreeable. But at really high levels of agreeableness, we have people that are willing to do anything for you because they're so agreeable. So, hey, can you help me move? Yeah, I'd love to help you move. And actually, I'm not going to be there. Could you just move my stuff for me? And I'll need you to rent a trunk. Oh, and I'll need you to pay for it. Okay, I will. So that's somebody who's really too high in agreeableness, will kind of do anything and be too trusting, is likely going to be taken advantage of. And then neuroticism, that's probably the one factor of the big five that most people would argue that it's better to be low in neuroticism than high in neuroticism. And it's hard to make an argument against that. That's one of the few ones that really seems to have kind of a positive negative balance. Okay, so as we've talked about these, hopefully you've thought, okay, well, I get that, but it doesn't seem quite that simple. I think it's more complex than those five factors. And in fact, whenever you measure the big five with things like the NEO PI or other personality measures, typically you measure the five major scales, and then you also measure subscales or facets of those larger scales. So like with conscientiousness, it has multiple facets. There's different ways to be conscientious. And again, according to the theorists, in general, you'll overall be high, medium, or low in conscientiousness, right? But there'll be some variability within the different facets. So you might be generally low in conscientiousness, but in consistent with that, you might be really low in terms of organization. You might be a really messy person. But then you might be really high in terms of punctuality. Always wanting to be places on time. And both of those are aspects of conscientiousness, and you might see some differences at the subscale level. So it's important to remember that, again, these five things emerge as factors, but they're not entirely unidimensional. And as I alluded to earlier, even though the big five has a substantial amount of support, empirical support, is really popular, the controversy persists. Not everyone buys into five factors. Some people say it should be less, some people say it should be more. But I think one of the most important kind of criticisms or limitations of the five-factor model is in terms of people can't agree on what the names of the factors should be. And I think it's important because people kind of just assume, oh, okay, well, the names emerge from the factor analysis, right? No, when you do factor analysis, you have these usually questions or items that cluster together. And then the researcher says, okay, all these items seem to look like they're measuring openness to experience. They come up with a name that emerges from research. It doesn't emerge from the data. And sometimes it's clear everybody can agree, okay, yeah, all these questions cluster together, and yeah, that's a great title for the fact that that's exactly what those things are measuring. Other times it's less clear about what those things are actually measuring, what that latent variable is that all those questions are getting at. So, support, but not without controversy. Speaking of controversy, one of the big controversies that's gone on and continues to go on related to trait research is this situation versus trait controversy. And most people point out the writings of Walter Mischel as kind of getting the party started. And Mischel, to his credit, stimulated a lot of research and debate, which is very good for science. And one of the things that Mischel argued was that traits do a poor job of predicting behavior, and he reviewed published studies and said, hey, in your own studies, you measure a trait, you measure behavior, and you get these correlations of 0.3, 0.4. That's really only accounts for 10% of the variability among a group of individuals. But nonetheless, you're using these measures of traits to make really important decisions about people's lives. That seems like a bad idea. And more than that, it doesn't seem that people are really all that consistent across situations. There's studies out here that show that there may be no such thing as personality, and that situation might be more important than any kind of individual trait. So what you do might depend more upon the demands of the situation than some sort of inherent thing about yourself. You don't have the evidence to back up the claims that you're making about these traits. So the response to Michelle and other people's criticisms, one of the things was, yeah, you're right, the numbers are low, but one of the reasons the numbers are low is we're measuring things really crappily. We have inadequate measurement. When we look at correlations, a relationship between a trait and a behavior, we're usually measuring a behavior, one behavior at one point in time, and that is poor measurement by the standards of psychological assessment. When you want to measure behavior, you take a larger sample of the behavior. So you don't say, what do they do now? You say, what do they do now? What do they do this day, this day, this day? You measure it multiple times, multiple situations, and then look at the relation between that and the trait. And the one thing that your book doesn't address, but some of the other researchers address, was we also may not be measuring traits entirely accurately. There is some measurement error when we're measuring how aggressive somebody is, and we come up with some number. That number reflects their true score plus measurement error. So it might be a little bit high, it might be a little bit low, due to error that's inherent in trying to measure any construct. So one reason numbers are low is because we're measuring things poorly, and some research show that if you do a better job of measuring behavior and measuring traits, you get higher correlations in that 0.3, 0.4 that Michelle was talking about. Another response, and this is an important one, that reflects actually some of the earlier stuff by Murray, is that it's also important to consider traitedness. Well, Murray and also Alpert. But the early theorists, the idea that not all traits are equal. Some traits might be more important than others in determining somebody's behavior. So, how important is it to you? How central is it to your identity, to your self-concept, to be outgoing or shy? And for people who are high in traitedness, who are very traded for that trait, if it's very important to you that, okay, I really see myself as a shy person, I really see myself as an extroverted person. For those people, that trait will predict behavior pretty well. For some people, certain traits are less relevant, like, I don't know, I'm kind of this, kind of that, I don't really care. For that trait, but for some other trait, very important. So how traded they are will impact how much that trait will influence the behavior versus the situation. And then the last argument made in response to the criticisms was that in terms of that idea of, well, how important is the information we're discovering, and even if the correlations are only 0.3, 0.4, and they say they're probably higher, we're counting for 10% of the variance, that's not important. And the argument is, well, how important it is subjective, and there's some research where accounting for 1%, 2% of the variance is significant and leads to significant changes in public policy. So we can't expect to explain all the variability in the data, because we understand that behavior is multiply determined. And trait theorists, except for some very naive ones, most of them never argue that you could explain differences in individuals' behaviors only based on understanding of their traits. They say it's one influence, and understanding one influence is important, even if it's not the only influence. So, the conclusion: there is evidence for stability of personality, and it can predict behavior if it's measured well. But Michelle was right to caution these researchers, who were, and more than the researchers, the, professionals who use personality measurements to make decisions. you need to make sure that you're using good measurement and that the measures are valid for their purposes. So make sure that there's evidence that this trait corresponds to the behavior that you're trying to make a decision about. So if you're making a decision about whether or not to release somebody from prison and you're using some measure of personality, you didn't do a really good job of measuring that outcome. Recidivism, return to prison, or if they reoffend. When you're initially gathering data, don't just look at one person, did they reoffend, yes or no. Look at how they reoffended in the context, gather lots of information about it, and then measure the trait as well as you can, and then make sure that there's a high enough correlation between those two things to justify using a measure of some trait to make that decision. And hopefully there's a kind of a lasting impact of Michelle's criticism in that way. Okay, a little bit about application of the trait approach. In the workplace, U.S. workplace, and other places as well, lots of reliance on personality inventories in hiring and promoting procedures. I remember my brother-in-law was complaining that he couldn't hire this guy who he thought was going to be a really great employee because he scored too low on a personality assessment. Why do y'all have these stupid things? I said, it's not mine, I'm sorry. But they have them and they use them because there's some evidence that they work. It's not just, we think these are good predictors. They've looked back and said, okay, we measured personality in all these people, and then we found out, were they good managers, bad managers, were they a good hire, bad hire, and then they looked at, okay, people who are there personality traits that distinguish between good manager, bad manager, between good hire, bad hire, and based on that, for those traits that we're able to distinguish, they kind of essentially use cut scores and say, okay, if you're this high on this trait or this low on this trait, we're going to hire you or we're not going to hire you. And the research around that is better now than it used to be. And they've used personality inventories longer than they've been effective at using them. But they're more effective at using them now than they have been before. But people should still be cautious about using them as the only input in hiring decisions or promotional decisions, because it's just one piece of information and shouldn't be used as the only piece of information. The other thing we're talking about would be self-reporting inventories, the large personality self-reporting inventories. The two big ones out right now are the MMPI-2 and the PAI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, second edition, and the Personality Assessment Inventory. Both of these ask lots of questions. I think the MMPI is 260 or so, and the PI is about 162 questions, I think. And for both of these, the questions load onto particular factors. And the factors, some of which are related to personality, some of which are related to psychopathology, your experience of depression and anxiety, some of which are related to other aspects of personality. Like in the MMPI, there's a masculinity, femininity scale that you score toward more masculine attitudes or more feminine attitudes. But for both of these, they're used with normative comparisons. So they gave these measures to a lot of people, to a normative sample, and found out, okay, what's the average score on this scale, this scale, this scale? On every scale, what's the typical score? And you come up with this kind of normal curve. Okay, here's where most people are, very few people are up here, and very few people are down here. And then you can kind of get these standardized data sets that you can then use to compare any other individual to. So now when you go take the MMPI or the PAI, your score will be compared to other people. So on the PAI, there's a verbal aggression subscale. So there's questions in the PI about yelling at people, and if you endorse more of those questions, like yeah, I do that a lot. If you answer more of those than anybody else, you'll score higher on the verbal aggression scale. And so if you answered exactly the same as the typical person, so if you answered yeah, sometimes yeah, but not very often, and the question in such a way that it's exactly how most people answered, you would get a score of 50T. That's in the middle. 50T, standardized on a 50 is the average, and then the standard deviation is 10. So if you answered really a lot more aggressive, you might be up to 2 standard deviations above the mean, so you might be 70T on that scale. If you endorse no verbal aggression whatsoever, you might be down at 30T. Right? You might be below the mean. Most people will be around 50. If you're anywhere 50 plus or minus 15, you think, okay, that's typical, maybe probably not significant. True of all, that's how you interpret those scales. Once they get above 1.5 to 2 standard deviations away from the mean, you start to think, this person's fairly different from the typical person for this trait or this aspect of personality or psychopathology. Might be important, might be something we need to pay attention to. So that's how they're interpreted. And one thing that's built into both of these measurements are questions to deal with certain response tendencies. So people that have like an acquiescence response set, where they just answer very true to everything, or people that answer never true to everything. If you do that, you can detect that with these how these tests are scored. You don't have to go through and look at, okay, are they all trues, or are they all falses, are they all ones, or are they all fours? You can computerize score these things, and it'll generate this a scale score that tells you, this person answered toward always saying true or very true, or always saying false or never true, which you're talking about. So you can identify response tendencies if they're there. Sometimes people will be motivated to fake good or fake bad. Faking good is whenever they want to deny any kind of negative characteristics or pathology, and then faking bad is whenever you want to endorse more negative characteristics and more pathology. And the faking good, obviously, is whenever you're usually trying to get a job or get something, and you're worried that they're going to not give it to you if they think you're weird or different or crazy. So I used to do assessments for applicants to the police department in Bryan, and you had to kind of go in knowing that all of them were going to fake good a certain amount. And if they didn't fake good, they looked bad. So you had to kind of take that into account. And that's kind of understandable. And sometimes people are like, well, why would you ever fake bad? Well, there's a couple of reasons to fake bad. One would be secondary gain, kind of workman's comp, trying to get out of something. If you're in prison and you're trying to get into if you think you'll get better care if you're in a psychiatric unit within the prison than in the general population, you might fake bad on one of these tests. But it also might be if you have some problems and you just really want people to know, you want to make sure that you're going to get the treatment you need, and so you exaggerate your symptoms and appear worse than you really are. But both of these tests can detect both of these types of responding. There's questions built in for faking good and faking bad. For faking good, that can also incorporates looking for social desirability. So might be questions like, I read the editorial in the paper every day. And if you put very true for that, that's going to load on the faking good scale, because nobody reads the editorial in the paper every day. If you want to look really good, you're trying to look really sharp and smart, you might lie about that. And then for the faking bad, there'll be symptoms that nobody endorses, that no kind of known clinical population says, yeah, that happens to me too. So I frequently dream of my dreams frequently go from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional to 4-dimensional. Nobody says that. And so if you say that, that loads on the faking bad scale, and so they can identify if you're to some degree, with some accuracy, they can identify people that are trying to misrepresent themselves. And they can also identify careless or idiosyncratic response. So we just go through and randomly answer stuff. They can catch that, and you're like, well, how do they know that? Well, one way they know is usually when you're asking about a particular trait, you ask more than one question about it. So you might ask, how often do you, or it might be a statement, I frequently get angry at other people. And then let's say you put very true. I frequently get angry at people. And then later on, there'll be another question that says, I rarely get upset with other people. Right? So asking the same sort of thing, but worded in a different way. And now if you say, I rarely get upset with people, very true. Now those two things are inconsistent. You said both, you frequently get angry with people, and you rarely get upset with people. You should answer those the same way. If you don't, there's an inconsistency, and that'll load on an inconsistency scale. And you can, when scoring the assessment, you can pick up on that as well. So with these inventories, you can pick up on people who aren't responding in a forthright or consistent manner. And that's good, because then you stop interpreting and you go, okay, well, they lied, or this is not interpretable. But it's bad in terms of then you still don't know anything about the person other than they didn't give you a valid assessment, and then you've got to go do more assessment. Okay, so we've talked about what the trait approach is, how it developed, how it's being used. Let's kind of review the pros and the cons. One good thing about it, attempting to be kind of a theoretical approach. The empirical approach that it endorses really, to some degree, reduces the impact of personal biases. You've probably picked up on with the psychodynamic theories. If you read the little blurbs about their biographies, you can really see that, okay, wow, this person's theory seems to be about themselves and about their childhood. And that's less true with the trait theorists, because they're leaning more on statistics to guide what traits emerge. But again, as I said before, there's no bias, because they're still selecting what questions to ask and what data goes into the factor analysis. Another kind of plus would be that it's very popular, especially the practical applications of trait theory in terms of the assessments based on trait approach, used in a variety of fields for a variety of purposes, and seemingly to good effect. I mean, people wouldn't continue using them if they didn't feel like they were making good decisions and getting good outcomes based on the decisions they were making. In terms of drawbacks, that the lack of an explanation of personality development is a bit of a problem for some people. In some ways, it's like, well, it sure would be nice if this theory said why people got the way they were. But in other ways, you might see this as a plus as well too, because it just kind of establishes a framework for looking at personality and says, okay, now for each different type of personality, how you get that way might be different, and now you have freedom. You're not encumbered by the kind of theoretical constraints that say, okay, well, it's probably because of this or because of this. It's up to you to go out and figure out, okay, well, why might this person be shy? Why might this person be neurotic? And there might be different reasons for those two different traits. And the last thing, somewhat of a, again, drawback, but also maybe a strength. There's still controversy about the trait approach in terms of what are the key traits that describe personality, and are there, can we boil it down to 3, 5, or 7 traits that describe comprehensively personality in a way that's meaningful and useful? But partly because of the ongoing controversy, there's not just kind of this one trait theory. There's a trait approach. So it's not so much a theory as an approach to studying personality, with some guidelines in terms of kind of this dimensional model and reliance on factor analysis. But beyond that, it doesn't look very much like some of the other theories that we've talked about and will talk about. Nonetheless, overall, again, very popular, and has permeated probably all the other theories we'll talk about from here on out. And people just kind of assume now, okay, well, yeah, there are these traits. People are a certain way. They're high or low on these certain things. But it hasn't always been that way. That was a very kind of novel idea in the not too distant past. So still an influential theory, and one that makes a lot of intuitive sense to people. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.